I think you set the stage well for us to start with our questions. I'm going to offer up a few broader-based quandaries. It's not difficult at all to differentiate between a one-time and ongoing expenditure, but we often talk about one-time revenues, and I'm offering each of you to respond. What really is a one-time revenue? I mean, is it expected revenue beyond budget or unexpected revenue beyond budget? If we're talking about recovery periods from recession being just 5 years, in effect, it's all one-time money, isn't it? Because it's going to go away again and it's going to come back. And so what really is one-time revenue? What's ongoing revenue? We've talked about the depth of the Great Recession over the past few years. We crossed the 100 billion general fund threshold for the first time in 2008. The LAO had projected that by 2012, just on the natural with inflation and population growth, that $103 billion would grow to $125 billion. In fact, by 2012, we were actually about 86, not counting the benefits of Prop 30. So that different, we lost a third of our revenue. Any recession could take away a third of our revenue. So what really is ongoing? What is one time? And if we had taken the LAO's projected revenue over the past 3-4 years, as opposed to the administration, which had argued that they were one time, well, would they over a 4-year period still be one time? No, they were really ongoing. And so I just throw that out there. I don't know that anyone's got the right answer to these questions, but I do ask them just to make the point that the lines are a little blurrier than what the governor might have suggested in his presentation this year or even in prior years.
Yes, this has been a great area of a discussion in our office as well, and it's really been made maybe more nuanced, maybe some people would say more complicated with Proposition 2 and the multi-year budgeting and the emphasis on multi-year budgeting that was placed in the Constitution. Because when we're putting together our budget, we're looking at that forecast period and really trying to understand what revenues and expenditures are going to be doing over the next several years. And when you do that, you see some implicit constraints associated with maintaining balance. And so while we don't have a specific definition of one-time revenues, I think that Proposition 2 probably gave us one proxy for one-time revenues by saying that capital gains revenues above 8% of general fund revenues, those are not reoccurring generally, and they're being set aside into the reserve. But where that line ends and when it becomes an ongoing revenue is really not something that is well defined. But our approach, as I said, was really looking at the long term and understanding the different things that are impacting both sides of the ledger and our ability to maintain balance over the next coming years.
Thank you.
If I could just add a couple of things, Mr. Chairman, because it's a very good question. I think two factors have made answering that question even more difficult. And one is that our revenue structure has become much more volatile. So it's not a static thing where the answer that you would give 20 years ago would be much different than what you give today.
When a greater proportion of our revenue came from sales tax.
Exactly.
To the top 1%.
And even on the personal income tax, capital gains were not such a prominent factor.
Right.
So you can think about it in some ways as well. It's the amount of revenue above a long-term average. That's kind of what you tried to do in Prop 2 with an 8% sort of capital gains threshold on which we take more money off. It was an attempt to say that, well, this is something over the long run you can kind of count on. Anything above that you need to be careful about. The problem, of course, is it's not just capital gains. The whole personal income tax and even other aspects of our tax structure are very volatile too. Our corporate income tax is very volatile. So I think that's what's made it harder, is that your question really reflects the greater volatility in our system, which means that the movements above an average growth over time is much greater. And then if you think about the type of downturns that we've had, the last three have been, I don't want to say unique because we tend to have more severe ones, from the defense industry restructuring of the early 90s, the dot-com bust to the Great Recession. These were large events, and I don't know if that's typical of what we should expect in the future or not, but clearly that just magnifies the volatility that's already inherent in our structure.
And then taking off from that question, we, of course, it's a rational concept, base our spending on what we determine our projected revenues will be. So we have our debate, we go with LAO, we go with administration, we pick a spot, and then once we know, well, once we determine what we think our revenues will be, we can then fill in the blanks as to what we can spend. But another way to approach it, given that the revenue is an arbitrary number, it is a completely arbitrary number. We embrace it and feel confident that we can move forward with it and base our spending on it, but it is an arbitrary number. If we were to come at it from a different approach, what do we need to spend to sustain the operational infrastructure of delivery of services to the people of California? And one example I'll use, because I know that there's strong bipartisan support for it and it's easy to identify, is our developmentally disabled services programs. We know, because we all hear from our communities, that the infrastructure, and much of it is a human infrastructure, is falling apart right in front of our eyes. So rather than base our spending on a program like that, dependent upon this arbitrary revenue number, why don't we determine what do we need to spend to make sure this does not crumble? And you could say the same for our physical infrastructures too. What do we need to spend to make sure that our bridges are not going to fall down, that our highways will continue to be able to operate, that our roads won't be completely pothole filled, and move forward from there? It also, I think, in some ways is a more honest conversation, because then we can, if we find we're in need of revenue, after we've determined what our needs are, can make a case, honestly, to the taxpayers of California to say, do we really have surplus revenue right now, or are we lacking right now to continue to be able to not just fund services, but to sustain infrastructures? What I'm hearing, I'm sure I'm not alone among members of this committee, is that with regard to DD services in our districts, that housing units are being lost, facilities are being closed, employees at the community-based organizations that supply services to our regional centers are leaving because these employees can find much better jobs than the $13 an hour, $14 an hour that some are being paid after 20 and 25 years of service. So of course they're going to look for greener pastures. What happens to that infrastructure? Now that's bad enough if it weren't for the case that we are systematically closing down our developmental centers, not only because we know we can get better human results and outcomes at the community level, but the federal government is insisting we move in that direction. So are we really doing our job adequately if we're not, rather than saying, well, what money's left over and we'll give it to this, determine what is a necessary level of funding? And so I know there's always the question, whether we're talking about developmentally disabled services or access to service for Medi-Cal beneficiaries, a determination of whether there is access to service. And Mr. Taylor, I wanted to ask you about how concerned you are. Are we hearing hyperbolic stories from our districts, or is this community infrastructure really at risk with specificity to DD services right now?
No, I think we're certainly hearing some of the same things. And I think you've had large growth in DDS spending, but you've also had large increases in caseload. And clearly there are problems in sort of keeping up with the demand for those services, proper concerns about the rates that are being provided to people. But But I guess, Mr. Chairman, you could have almost every program area in the budget come in and tell you they need a lot more. And I think what I draw more from it is that you're sort of suggesting that this is one of our highest priorities. And I think that's completely appropriate, that when you look first to what you need to spend, and maybe you do need, maybe you think you need more revenue, but that what budgeting is about is sort of highlighting what you think are the most important areas. And certainly I would agree with you, this is an important one.
Ms. Bosler?
Yes, DDS is a very important area of our budget, and we do have some targeted proposals that we think are very important to strengthening the community. This is a very exciting time, I think, in the state of California related to DD. We are finally closing the state's developmental centers, with the exception of the secure facility at Porterville. So this is something that has been in the works for many, many years. But with this is really, there needs to be a additional shift in the culture over at the Department of Developmental Services to really focus in and provide more support for the regional centers. Decades ago, my understanding is that the state had a very strong research and analytical support, and over many years through the recessions, those resources were chipped away and eliminated. And our budget makes a very important $1.3 million investment at the state level to really build up those resources at the Department of Developmental Services so that we can better understand what's going on in the community in terms of trends in services that are needed and resources that are needed, so we can plan ahead and better make the investments that the state does in the community, so that we're providing the services that are needed by the changing demographics of the population. And as Mr. Taylor said, the growth has been significant over the last few years. Regional center expenditures have grown by 24%. And this is well beyond caseload and inflation. And there's really some other drivers there that we need to better understand. Some of them is an aging population that's requiring more services and supports, more people who are interested in moving out of their homes and into independent living services. And then, of course, the autism, the rise of autism that started about 20 years ago to be a much more prevalent developmental disability that the state system is serving. So in addition to some additional $128 million that we're also targeting to build community infrastructure to support the transition of individuals currently living in the centers into the communities. These are monies that are going to actually build brick and mortar, remodel existing facilities to build these small businesses so that we can move individuals that are currently at the developmental centers into the community. There's also $50 million general fund for targeted rate increases, specifically to those alternative residential models that provide really the backbone of independent living in the community. And these are facilities that, because of best practices, have been moving towards 6 beds to 4 beds to really align with models of really being the most home-like and less institutional. And so these homes are an important linchpin of the system of supports in the community. There's also additional monies for increased case managers at the regional center level so that they can be better handling the cases that do come in. And then finally, some additional monies to help providers deal with the additional changes that are coming down from the home and community-based waiver that the federal government imposed a few years ago, and that the state will have to comply with. And so there's a lot of change that's happening in our in the regional center world, and we hope that our budget will help to support that going forward.
And I know we've got a lot of other issues in addition to DDS to talk about, but I do want to recognize and compliment the governor, first of all, for his statement that any additional revenues that might be identified through the MCO tax reform could be used over and above the general fund dollars that are currently in the budget. And then also in recognition, because I have been suggesting to the advocacy community for years that yes, reinvestment, restoration funding must be expended, but nothing could be better than a new and dedicated revenue source, and that we could do through this tax reform. Because then, as Mr. Taylor suggested, those dollars are going to be less volatile and less at risk of any potential future recession. Those dollars will be ongoing, and so I think that's the safest bet for that particular community, and I think that it makes great sense for us to, as a bipartisan body, to look at that. I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'm going to let our committee ask questions as well. Would either of you suggest that before the cuts that we made that were demanded by the Great Recession, that levels of funding for any particular area of, and in particular, social safety net spending were overfunded? I mean, there's always a need, right? We always know that there's greater demand out there than what we can provide. But just thematically, I don't know anyone would argue that we were overfunding social service programs before 2008. And the reason I ask that is that if we think if it wasn't underfunded, it was at least minimally funded, that we made these huge cuts. They've only been slightly restored. Do we want to suggest that even in these boom times, that this is our new normal? Or do we have a goal of getting back to where we were, at least in adjusted dollars, to the 2008 level at some point? And if we do want to get back to that level of funding, I'm sure it wouldn't be difficult to determine what that level of funding was, if a variety of metrics, maybe even percentage of general fund for each of these issue areas. If not now, then the question is when, because it's certainly not going to happen during the next downturn, and quite likely we'll have to make additional cuts. So the level of funding we were at 2008 for these programs got cut to where we are now. They're likely to get cut again. And we continue to create a new normal level of funding, which is ever, ever lower. Now, interestingly, what we don't ever touch are tax expenditures. They seem to be frozen into our budget. They're passed with simple majority votes. They have to be changed with 2/3 majority votes, so it's ever less likely that happens. So a certain part of our budget gets frozen, and those who benefit from those kind of expenditures never have to risk or experience any threat to their level of state support. But this other area, and we're talking about those with the least ability to speak up for themselves or to fund disabled, blind, aged people, their level of funding continues to get cut, and it doesn't seem like we ever get back to where we were, which no one is arguing was ever overfunded.
I would just note, Mr. Chairman, that last year in our Health and Human Services write-up, we tried to provide some perspective on the very issue you raised about how the programs had been affected since the year before the start of the Great Recession. And it was sort of a mixed bag, I think. You can go back and take a look at it. But in some cases, in IHSS, for example, when you restored the 7% reduction. They were sort of back where they had been prior to 7-8, while, as Ms. Bosler noted, DDS services spending had grown faster than inflation, but we'd had such an increase in caseload that per spending was down. Grant levels had not been provided COLAs. They had dropped in real value. In other programs such as health, we had so much more federal dollars. They were doing much better than the case before. So it was a more complicated story, I think, than you might first imagine, but it did provide some perspective on the very issue that you're raising. Without regard, as you say, whether you thought 7-8 levels were appropriate, the best, or whatever. It just tried to compare where we were, sure, I think, as of 14-15 with that 7-8 year.
I'm going to go back and look at that. Thank you. Ms. Bosler, any comment?
Yeah, in terms of the CalWORKs program, the state has provided 2 back-to-back 5% grant increases, and those were provided via the general fund, but more importantly, there is an ongoing mechanism providing additional COLAs, and that was through the dedication of a portion of the realignment revenues that were freed up when the state took over healthcare reform, and also then freed up some of those county monies that had been spent on indigent health, but are instead now being redirected to the state. And a portion of the revenues under that complicated funding swap were dedicated to providing ongoing COLA adjustments when monies are available in that account. There is not enough money for an additional COLA that's been built up in that account in the budget year that we project, but there is opportunities in the future as those revenues grow for additional monies to be dedicated to further increasing the CalWORKs COLA. I think it's important every year to take a look at all of our social safety net programs, understand what's working, what's not working, where we are relative to the poverty level, where we are relative to other states. And it's just really a matter, I think, from our perspective about what the state can afford ongoing. This budget makes a proposal to put forward an SSI, SSP COLA. I think when we looked around this year, we knew that this is a population that has not gotten a state COLA since 2006, and we thought it was an important investment to include in the January budget. Your question is a difficult one, but it is certainly something we think about when we're looking at programs and understanding what's working and where we are relative to the federal poverty level.
Thank you for your forthright answer, and I think we all agree we are faced with tough questions and with no necessary right answers. We're going to start with Senator Nielsen, then Senator Woke, and Senator Roth. Got my list going. All right, Senator.
Mr. Taylor, I made mention, and you kind of got into it just a little bit more narrowly than I, about the legislature not having control of the budget. I talked about it to a greater degree over a longer period of time, how we've abdicated our authority over the budget. Do you see an ability of the legislature to wrest some of that budgetary authority back into our own control? Because I think we've ceded an awful lot. I don't know that if we can ever turn it around.
That's a very good question, Senator. I think it's very hard to get it back. In some cases, for example, when you moved some control section, the provisions in the back of the budget, you moved some, especially with regards to capital outlay, you moved it to a statute. Well, that means if you want to change the law, you have to have a governor's signature. Whereas if it's in the budget, you just don't put it in if you don't want to give them the authority. That's very hard to get back. Other things like, control over the university's capital budgets, I think you could get that back right away if you wanted to. Well, not easy, but you could do it. But a lot of this decision-making, every time you give the authority to somebody else or the Department of Finance to making decisions that in the past you've made, it is very difficult to get back.
Well, I think the point I'm making, and I asked you to help us just by pointing out the occasions where this occurs, and your folks noted, we may miss some of them. I'm trying to be very fastidious about finding these out and making mention of what happens. But I believe that we're almost making the legislature irrelevant. Maybe we go through the exercise and pound our chest and try to think we're important, but the agencies know better. And this has been a steady erosion over a long period of time. It's not a new phenomena, but it's a phenomenon I think we better get about and pay attention to. Regarding the provider increases, the managed care tax, we would like to see something done there, but we've proposed a mechanism of pay-as-you-go, so to speak, that as state revenues would improve, that there would be a trigger mechanism kick in, and a portion of that after Prop 98 and the prudent reserve, we would fund a certain level of increase. Is that a good way to do some increases in set programs or an automatic trigger for certain?
Well, Senator Nielsen, I'd have to probably know a little bit more about that specific proposal, but just let me tell you why I'm a little cautious here. Almost every initiative that has increased a tax in the last 20 years has dedicated the funds for particular purposes. And from a budgeting perspective, that's just a terrible development, no matter how well-meaning or how well-purposed they may have been in that first year when the measure was passed. That's not what budgeting's about. It's about changing priorities, as you know, and being able to make decisions. And I would hate to sort of suggest a further example of where you're tying your own hands by dedicating funds for a particular program level.
Yeah.
These issues are coming up all over the place. I know there's been concern about the administration's numbers of the Prop 47 savings.
Yeah.
And the issue there is that the initiative proponents gave the Department of Finance the sole ability to make that determination.
My thought on that, we're keeping it in the hands of the legislature to make a determination, but and that would be in the budget and something that we could change in another year.
That's certainly better.
That's my point there. We've done a lot with the so-called realignment of prisons, and a shift, dramatic, massive shift to local government. But spending has not gone down. In fact, you're talking, it could be suggested we're going to have to build some more prison space. Numbers will be increasing. Why has the prison budget gone up when the numbers have so drastically gone down? Now, the secretary last year told me it was because of the courts. I could not accept that.